Right, so you probably know about the horrendous conditions aboard slave ships, which at their largest could hold 400 people. But it's worth underscoring that each slave had an average of 4 square feet of space. That is 4 square feet. As one eyewitness testified before Parliament in 1791, they had not so much room as a man in his coffin. Once in the Americas, the surviving slaves were sold at a market very similar to the way cattle would be sold. After purchase, slave owners would often brand their new possession on the cheeks, again, just as they would do with cattle. The lives of slaves were dominated by work and terror, but mostly work. Slaves did all types of work, from housework to skilled crafts work, and some even worked as sailors, but the majority of them worked as agricultural laborers. In the Caribbean and Brazil, most of them planted, harvested, and processed sugar, working 10 months out of the year, dawn until dusk. When it came time to harvest and process the cane, speed was incredibly important, because once cut, sugar sap can go sour within a day. This meant that slaves would often work 48 hours straight during harvest time, working without sleep in the sweltering sugar press houses where the cane would be crushed in hand rollers and then boiled. Slaves often caught their hands in the rollers, and their overseers kept a hatchet on hand for amputations. Ugh. Ultimately then, what makes slavery slavery is that slaves are dehumanized. The Latin word that gave us chattel also gave us cattle. In many ways, Atlantic slavery drew from a lot of previous models of slavery and took everything that sucked about each of them and combined them into a big ball so that it would be the biggest possible ball of suck. Stan, am I allowed to say suck on this show? Nice. Okay, to understand what I'm talking about, we need to look at some previous models of slavery. Let's go to the thought bubble. The Greeks were among the first to consider otherness a characteristic of slaves. Most Greek slaves were barbarians, and their inability to speak Greek kept them from talking back to their masters, and also indicated their slave status. Aristotle, who despite being spectacularly wrong about almost everything was incredibly influential, believed that some people were just naturally slaves, saying, "It is clear that there are certain people who are free and certain people who are slaves by nature, and it is both to their advantage and just for them to be slaves." This idea, despite being totally insane, remained popular for millennia. The Greeks popularized the idea that slaves should be traded from far away, but the Romans took it to another level. Slaves probably made up 30% of the total Roman population, similar to the percentage of slaves in America at slavery's height. The Romans also invented the plantation, using mass numbers of slaves to work the land on giant farms called latifundia, so called because they were not fun. The Judeo-Christian world contributed as well, and while we are not going to venture into the incredibly complicated role that slavery plays in the Bible, because I vividly remember the comment section from the Christianity episode, the Bible was widely used to justify slavery, and in particular the enslavement of Africans, because of the moment in Genesis when Noah curses Ham, saying, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." This encapsulates two ideas vital to Atlantic slavery. One, that slavery can be a hereditary status passed down through generations, and two, that slavery is the result of human sin. Both ideas serve as powerful justifications for holding an entire race in bondage.
Haiti is always described as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. But during its height at Saint-Domingue, it was the richest place in the Americas. The thing about it, though, is that its richness was all rooted in slaves. Its wealth was based on human capital, on owning that human capital.
All day, as long as the sun is shining, the men are bending over and swaying a machete at the foot of the sugarcane.
The world as you know it disappears. Therefore, you become an animal, and you expect to live like an animal.
The dominion of the master had to be absolute, but that absoluteness itself made the master into something other than human as well.
I am Toussaint Louverture. My name is perhaps known to you.
He was called the Black George Washington. he fought off 3 empires and enraged Napoleon.
The prospect of a Black Republic is equally disturbing to the Spanish, the English, and the Americans.
He championed liberty and égalité for all, Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution.
Liberty, equality, fraternity, that was new for the world.
Toussaint Louverture is the epitome of humanity. He realized early on that the condition he was in was totally insufferable.
Toussaint Louverture recruited about 3,000 to 4,000 people, trained them, and they fought the French, the British, and the Spanish army for 12 years.
They burned the mechanisms of their production. They're burning the plantation fields, burning down the houses.
It was a wholesale massacre on a really, really enormous scale. It was a big, big, major payback time.
The Haitian Revolution is probably the most profound revolution ever realized by human beings. The only place where slaves created a nation. But nobody wants to talk about it.
In the summer of 1789, when Haiti was still the dormant colony of Saint-Domingue, it was France that grabbed the world's attention. Parisian mobs rioted against the French king and against their own desperate poverty. Chanting slogans for liberty, equality, and brotherhood, they sparked the revolution that would fill history books for centuries to come.
The trick about the French Revolution was that it meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
In the streets of Paris, the French Revolution meant an end to the appalling privileges of wealth. And France's brand new Congress, called the National Assembly, it meant the ideas of Europe's most radical thinkers could be realized.
Nobody knows exactly what's going to come out of it, but just the idea of having rights, right? The idea that all people have rights, that those rights are inherent. This was something that obviously philosophers had written about before, but during the course of the French Revolution, it was written down in a text called the Declaration of the Rights of Man.
What was a dangerous idea in France was even more dangerous in its slave-holding colonies off the coast of Florida, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and an island known as the Pearl of the Antilles. Today, the western half is Haiti. Then it was the French colony of Saint-Domingue.
We have to remember that the ocean was like a highway in the 18th century. I mean, the ships were constantly bringing news back and forth. Everyone was obsessed with news. Sailors would come off the ships. The first people they would talk to, the people they would work with as they were unloading the ships, were enslaved people. So there are reports who were describing the events that have been going on in Paris to the enslaved that are working alongside of them.
Few intended colonial slaves should take democratic ideas to heart. Far too much was at stake. Sugar greased the wheels of the 18th century economy, and Saint-Domingue was the sugar capital of the world. It was easy, even for France's political radicals, to ignore the agony that made it all possible.
The leaves of the sugarcane are just like minuscule saw. If they cut you, you may not even see it. But when you perspire, the sweat gets in it and it burns. In the roots, there are ants. They bite. And when they bite you, you will scratch yourself for half a day.
If the worker refuses to work, well, there is a law which you just shoot him, that's all.
The whole concept of slavery itself is a totally savage one. The French, they brought it down to science. A slave coming from Africa would not last 3 years, the way the system was organized. They had it down to that kind of statistics.
The accounts about the tortures inflicted on slaves are often horrifying. Legs cut off or arms cut off, amputations for runaways, rubbing hot powder or pepper and so forth into the wounds. Slaves actually hung and left to die. The human life was given so little value that these tortures were kind of refined to this incredible, cruel effect.
Despite the brutal tools of control, some blacks managed to escape slavery. Many had been born free, fathered by white planters. Others had gained freedom through their own wits or talents. One such man was Toussaint Louverture.
I was born a slave, but nature gave me the soul of a free man.
Toussaint Louverture was a very determined man. He was a very ambitious man. And in my opinion, he was a genius.
Toussaint is, I think, one of the most incredible figures that I know about in many ways. He's born on a plantation in Saint-Domingue. He grows up on that plantation.
That plantation was owned by a man who was tolerant for the times. Toussaint was taught to read and write as a child.
He eventually occupies a somewhat privileged role, if you can say that, on a plantation as a coachman and has a kind of relationship with the managers and masters in some ways. He becomes free in the 1770s, so he's somebody who kind of occupied different roles in society. And I think that's the key for understanding Toussaint, is that he saw possibilities where other people didn't.
He had businesses, had contacts in the US and elsewhere, bank accounts, managed his affairs pretty well. The man was endless in organizational capacity. I mean, he would have been a fantastic CEO today.
Toussaint didn't record his first reactions to the revolution in France, but his fellow free Saint-Domingueans, the white colonials, and the mixed-race population were transfixed.
In 1789, there were about 40,000 white people and about 30,000 colored people who were, of course, their sons and cousins and so on and so forth, who were landowners themselves, many of them, slave owners themselves, many of them, very effective businessmen, many of them, involved romantically with the white master class.
One of the things that's important to remember about Haiti and race is it wasn't simply black and white. Instead, you had numerous gradations of color. One historian went so far as to give 110 categories of color, from absolute black to absolute white. And to each combination, he gave a name: mulatto, quadroon, Mamaluke. And what he was accounting for was the drops of black blood.
Whites hoped for more control over the colony's governance, but the colony's mixed-race population hoped for more fundamental changes. They had been born free, but not equal.
They had to show physical respect for the white. Stand up when they are in presence of a white, call them Mr. or whatever title they wanted to have. It was not easy for them, and that's exactly why they were the first one, before the blacks, they were the first one to ask for equality.
The mixed-race population of Saint-Domingue decided their chance had come in 1791. They sent a petition to France's new government asking for the rights of citizenship. The petition asked for civil protections, and it enraged the island's white population. Working-class colonists began a full-scale intimidation campaign. They threatened, beat, and murdered mixed-race residents in the capital. But the petition met a different reception back in Paris. The new breed of delegates in the National Assembly issued a landmark decree. They extended equal rights to the small population of mixed-race people born of two free parents. Despite the reform's limited extent, the governor of Saint-Domingue refused to obey. Colonial whites felt profoundly betrayed. Some, such as a planter's wife named Madame de Rouvray, began discussing radical thoughts of their own.
The National Assembly is committed to destroying our lives as masters, so much so that secession from France might be necessary. The slave owners of America, I hope, will band together to stop this contagion of liberty.